Chapter 15. 5:50 p.m. Arabian Standard Time. 10:50 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The Hamad Desert, Western Iraq. They called it the Little Bird. Sometimes they called it the Flying Egg. It was the MH-6 helicopter, fast and light, highly maneuverable. The kind of chopper that didn't need room to land. It could come down on small rooftops and on narrow roadways in crowded neighborhoods. It was the chopper most beloved by Special Operations Forces. Luke and Ed rode in one out into the stark, high desert of western Iraq. The surreal, undulating desert landscape below them was orange-yellow, with vast, blackened, sun-blasted regions. Parts of it looked like parking lot blacktop. The sky was pale blue, with a giant orange orb of the sun moving toward the horizon. It was an alien landscape. Hot winds blew in through the open bay doors. Luke knew they were being followed by 2 Apache helicopter gunships, armored, and armed to the teeth with 30mm miniguns and Hydra rockets. The Apaches were flying high above them and well to the south, but they were outfitted with state-of-the-art radar and ground video systems. They could see well enough. Luke and Ed were not talking. Ed's bulk slouched beside him in the cramped compartment. They both wore flight suits and helmets. Luke wore a heavy tactical vest, as did Ed. The weight had settled onto Luke, making him feel as if gravity had doubled. His pants were lined with lightweight armor. Luke was armed with his MP5 submachine gun and a Remington pump-action shotgun. He felt the heft of both guns. They were heavy. The weight was reassuring. The MP5 was loaded with armor-piercing rounds. If there were bad guys here, those rounds should punch through most body armor they could be wearing. Luke had 6 magazines fully loaded, just in case he needed them. In Delta, they let you carry what you wanted, what you felt would be effective. Don kept that tradition intact. The sounds of the chopper blades and the winds were nearly deafening, but he and Ed could talk if they wanted to. So far, they hadn't. But Luke felt he should try to mend fences a little bit. It was hard to go into combat sitting next to a man who hated him. "Ed!" Luke shouted. Ed nodded, but didn't say anything. "You got a problem with me? That's fine. But don't get me killed out here, okay?" Ed looked at him with squinted eyes. "What do you take me for, man?" "An angry kid." "I'm a professional," Ed said. He raised a big, gloved fist. "I'll hurt you with this, but I ain't gonna let these men out here hurt you. Ruin my enjoyment?" He shook his head. Luke nodded. "Good enough. Just remember who's in charge." The pilot's voice appeared inside Luke's headset. "Guys, ETA 2 minutes. 2 minutes to the drop site. This is a touch and go, just like we said in the briefing. So when I set it down, do your thing, or you'll be hanging off my rails. 2 minutes. Luke and Ed grabbed their weapons and clambered out onto the wooden side-mounted bench seats, their legs dangling in the air. The chopper adjusted to the redistribution of weight. They came in low over the camp, just above a cluster of tents, their entry flaps blowing in the wind. The camp was bigger than it had looked in the satellite photos. Much of it had been deliberately obscured by sand-colored tarps. Still, the place seemed like a ghost town. No one was out. The Little Bird pilot hit the old helipad directly in the middle. He touched down, and both men slid out onto the hard-packed desert gravel. 3 seconds later, the chopper was back in the air. Luke and Ed ran across the dusty campsite, holding up in the shade of a low cinder block outbuilding. The chopper banked hard to the right, turning toward the north and east, out of harm's way. Within seconds, it was a speck moving higher and now turning toward the south. It would circle at a safe distance until they called it back. "Okay," Ed said. "You're the boss. What first?" Luke gestured with his head. "Those large tents in the middle there. I'd say that is, or was, the headquarters." "What about these buildings?" Ed said. "Food storage and weapons storage, if I had to guess." Ed nodded, then shrugged, as if he wasn't sure. "What do you think they are?" Luke said. "I have no idea, white man. They pay you to do the thinking." "Don't think, in that case," Luke said. "Guess." Ed peered around the corner at the tents blowing in the wind. "Those tents are half collapsed. Look like they've been sitting out here in the weather by themselves for days, if not weeks. My guess? If we don't find dead people inside them, they're decoys. From the air, they make this place look abandoned, or like somebody wiped it out. If the place is still active, then at least one of these buildings is the entrance to a bunker or underground complex. If I was a bad guy right now, I'd be playing dead and doing it where nobody could see me. You can't hide this camp from satellites, but you can make it look like nobody's home." Luke nodded. "Okay, I like that. What do you say we cross over there, see what we find in the tents? Maybe what we're looking for is there." Ed gazed across the open terrain toward the tents. "You gonna get me killed out there?" Luke shook his head. "You cover me. I'll go first." Ed smiled a bit. "See what I mean? A little respect, that's all I ask. Recognize that I'm alive, too." Luke didn't touch any of that. "On your go," he said. Ed waited a beat. He took a breath. "Go." Luke took off. The sky was huge above him. His feet pounded and arms pumped, and he dashed across the open space, totally exposed. The main tent seemed like it was miles away. A second later, he was there. He burst through the entryway and inside. Inside, it was darker and cooler than outside. Luke lay on the floor, breathing hard for a few seconds. He looked around. There was nothing in the tent. Nothing at all. He moved to the opening, took out his gun, and got ready to lay covering fire. Ed ran across the 50-yard gap. No one took a shot. Nothing moved. Ed crouched near him. His big face was red and sweaty. It was hot out there. "Uh-oh," Luke said. "Looks like you might be a little—" Suddenly a tracer ripped through the thick canvas of the tent a few feet above their heads. It tore a hole out of the other side as it went. "Damn it!" Luke shouted. "Down! Get down!" Ed hit the ground. An instant later, gunfire was strafing the air just above their heads. There was no sense even trying to fight back. They lay in place. Their one saving grace. 30 fighters or thereabouts, emerging from 2 stone buildings and converging on a cluster of tents. "We're in those tents," Luke shouted. "Roger that. Keep your heads down, boys. It's about to get hot down there." "Watch the tents," Ed screamed. A few seconds later, a sound came. It was low at first, building and becoming louder, a whistling sound. Then it was a shriek, still coming, impossibly loud. Still coming. It split the day apart. Luke tore his helmet off and covered his ears. It screamed by overhead. Somewhere nearby, an explosion rent the air. Ba-boom! A blast of heat roiled the air inside the tent. Luke crawled like a worm toward the edge of the tent. He pulled a canvas flap up an inch from the ground. Outside, men were running. One of the low outbuildings was on fire. The bad guys were no longer interested in Luke and Ed. They knew what was above their heads, and they knew how bad it was. There was nowhere to run, but they tried anyway. The sound of a chopper's rotor blades beat the ground as it made a low pass. An ugly blat of automatic gunfire ripped the sky as its minigun opened up. Luke saw men come apart as they ran, arms, legs, and heads flying in different directions, foundations spraying blood before falling to the ground. He looked away. Another Hydra rocket sounded, the missile whistling, then shrieking. Luke rolled away from the tent edge and curled into a ball. He saw that Ed had already done so. Ba-boom! Now another minigun opened up. The choppers were up there, just above them, clearing the space. He prayed they didn't clear this tent by accident. Luke went into a vague state of mind. It almost seemed like he was dreaming. Somewhere, Becca lay on an operating table giving birth to his son. Somewhere, Martinez lay in a hospital bed begging Luke to kill him. Somewhere, Captain Ahab's ship was sunk by a gigantic white whale. At some point, the shooting and bombing stopped. Quiet descended, and Luke could hear the sound of the desert wind again. Outside, it was evening, and the sky was dark, and it was also red, yellow, and orange. He could hear the crackling of flames. "Groundhog," the radio said. "Come in, Groundhog. This is Viper 1. Viper 1 calling Groundhog. Stone? Are you alive? Stone?" Luke crawled to the radio. Across the way, Ed was still curled into a ball, staring at him. Ed was smart. He still had his helmet on. Luke picked up the radio. "Viper 1, this is Groundhog. We are alive and well." "Groundhog, this is Viper 1, the drawl said. "Your zone is cleared of enemy. We are on patrol above your location and are unopposed. We have a relayed message from the king. If you are operational, then conduct your search." "Copy," Luke said. He looked at Ed. "I told you, man," Ed said. "Those tents were a decoy." They walked out into the night desert air. Much of the camp was on fire. Bodies of enemy fighters lay all across the ground, many of them ripped to shreds. For a moment, Luke remembered that morning in eastern Afghanistan. But that wasn't like this. Most of those Taliban had died in close-quarter fighting and from small-arms fire. Their bodies were largely intact. These men had been eviscerated by the Apaches. A couple of the outbuildings must have been weapons storage. They had blown apart when hit by the rockets, and now black, oily smoke was pouring into the sky. "Didn't leave us much to search, did they?" Luke and Ned walked to a corrugated steel hut that had barely been hit in the fighting. It was pockmarked with fist-sized holes from the miniguns, but beyond that, it was in good shape. A padlock held the door shut. Ed smashed the lock off with his rifle. They slid the door back. Both Luke and Ed went to their headlamps. They shined their lights around the room inside. It took Luke's eyes a moment to adjust to the lighting. Then he couldn't quite believe what he was looking at. What is this stuff doing here? Chapter 16. 10:45 p.m. Central European Summer Time. 4:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Institut Le Rosé, Rolle, Switzerland. "Good night, babe," Rita said, loud enough to be heard. "Good night, babe," Elizabeth called. "Have fun." "You too," Rita said. "Yeah," Elizabeth said. "Fun as always." Elizabeth almost couldn't believe she was going through with it. Rita had called for the car service, and it had just passed through the front gates of the school. She was dressed and headed out the door. She wore a tight mini-dress that hugged her curves. Her long hair hung straight down. She wore heavy makeup with black eyeliner, black lipstick, and sparkly glitter, torn stockings, and black high heels. She looked sexy and trashy, like she was going to a monster ball. She held up a piece of paper just before she pulled open the front door of her suite. "You can do this." Then she crumpled up the paper and stuck it in her tiny, glittery purse. "Night," she said, and opened the door. Elizabeth went back through the bathroom and into her own suite of rooms. She almost couldn't breathe, she was so excited. Excited, nervous, terrified. The walls of the suite seemed to close in, then expand, almost as if the place itself was breathing. She checked her preparations. At the moment, she was wearing a pair of gray sweatpants and a long-sleeved t-shirt. The t-shirt was made out of long john-type material. The nights were still chilly here in the mountains. She had sneakers on her feet. She had a book bag packed with her own mini dress, high heels, makeup, and cell phone. The TV in her living area was on, loud, like she had been playing it for months, loud enough for the man out in the hall to hear it. Her window out to the roof was already open. She was in the habit of ignoring her Secret Service man at night and just going to bed without telling him. The way she played it, she would turn off the lights and leave the TV set on. Then she would watch in the dark. It was a perfectly normal thing to do. She did that now. She sat for a moment in the eerie glow of the TV and the night. A show was on an American satellite station. A show about New Jersey mobsters she had long enjoyed, but she couldn't focus on it right now. It was now or never. Rita was going to wait 5 extra minutes, then go. If it was going to happen, it was all on Elizabeth's shoulders, as it should be. This wasn't Rita's problem. This wasn't Rita's part. She had helped Elizabeth concoct the plan, but Elizabeth had to seize the freedom for herself. One night, one crazy night of fun, madness, daring, and rebellion, and she would never be able to do this again. From now on, her security would be so tight she'd be lucky to be able to move from room to room without a big man in a suit with an earpiece looking over her shoulder. Okay, let's do this. She stood up silently and picked up her book bag. She moved toward the window. She still didn't have to do it. She hadn't committed yet. She could turn back at any moment. If the Secret Service man suddenly burst in, she could still explain it away. She was just standing by the window, breathing in the night air, with a book bag in her hand. And in the book bag were clothes to go out clubbing. Stop it. Just go. So she did. She raised a leg and stuck it out the window. The roof was below floor level here, so she had to sit up on the windowsill for a second. She dropped down to the roof with a light thump. Oh, God! Did he hear that? She crouched down and looked back through the window at the front door to her apartment. There was light under the door from the hallway. She felt like she could almost see the shadow of her bodyguard standing out there. No one came. The man didn't knock or make any move to open her door. She shrugged to herself, turned, and moved quickly and quietly across the slate roof. It was angled slightly downward. In a moment, she reached the corner. She got down on her knees and felt underneath. The rain gutter was there, just as Rita said it would be. Elizabeth looked across the lawn, and there, maybe 100 yards away, a black car was parked in the turnaround, its headlights on, waiting. At night, there was a second Secret Service man stationed at the front door of the dormitory, and she knew that every 30 minutes or so, he would take a walk around the building. Let's hope that walk doesn't happen now. She slipped the backpack over her shoulders. Now here came the tricky part. She reached both hands under the roof, then swung her entire body over. Her legs followed her torso and hit the stucco wall hard, scraping her knee. That hurt, but she held on. The remnants of her gymnastics training as a young girl were still with her. Now she shimmied down, holding the pipe with her hands, her feet walking down the wall. It was easy. Near the ground, she dropped and rolled backward onto her butt on the wet grass. She lay there for a moment, breathing deeply. Holy moly, she had just done that. That was some James Bond stuff. Then it occurred to her that Rita had already done the same thing, at least twice. Okay. She jumped up, turned, and ran across the lawn to the waiting car. It seemed to take forever to reach it. The rear door popped open as she approached. She practically dove inside. Rita was there, inside the luxurious black car. She smiled. There was a piece of paper on her lap. Don't talk about it. Elizabeth nodded, pulled the door shut, and smiled. Now they were inside the car and behind smoked glass. No one could see them in here. You ready? Rita said. Elizabeth was out of breath, but tried to speak calmly. Finally. The car rolled slowly across campus. Elizabeth looked at the driver behind the glass partition. He was piloting the car with extreme caution. He probably didn't want to run over the child of a Russian gangster. He was a blonde-haired guy, middle-aged, and didn't seem the slightest bit interested in either Elizabeth or Rita. They approached the gate and the guardhouse. Elizabeth held her breath. The guard on duty barely glanced at them. He was inside the lighted guardhouse, doing something with paperwork. He looked up and raised a hand. The wrought iron gate slid open. They were out. As they pulled away from the campus, Rita squeezed Elizabeth's hand. The driver opened his window a crack and lit a cigarette. "Next stop, Geneva," he said over the car's intercom. Rita looked at Elizabeth. "This is going to be a fun night," she said. Chapter 17. 11:55 p.m. Arabian Standard Time. 4:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The Embassy of the United States in Iraq, a.k.a. the Republican Palace. The International Zone, a.k.a. the Green Zone. Kark District, Baghdad, Iraq. "It's a very strange thing." Luke shook his head. "I know it." He was sitting across the plywood conference table from Trudy Wellington and Mark Swan. In the center of the table was a black plastic octopus that, up until a few moments ago, had been speaking as though it was Don Morris. It was a speakerphone, and Don had patched through on a call from the United States. The meeting had just broken up. Ed Newsom had been here, but after the meeting was over, he had left in a huff. He and Luke had been in combat together twice now, had completed 2 successful missions, and were still no closer to friends. Big Daddy Cronin and his British alter ego Montgomery had been here as well, but they had slid away to whisper together about possibilities. That left Luke leaning back in an old wooden office chair, picking the brains of the young intelligence agents still in the room with him. The corrugated hut at the desert camp had been full of clothes. Not just clothes, but Western-style clothes. The type of clothes that young people would wear in rich Western democracies. European fashions, American jeans and T-shirt ensembles, leather jackets and boots, sunglasses and jewelry. The jewelry might be very convincing costume jewelry, or it might be the real thing. It was all being investigated, and Luke hadn't heard anything about it yet. Knowing Iraq, and from what he had seen this morning, he guessed the jewelry was real gold, real diamonds. There had also been laptop computers in the hut, along with cell phones, MP3 players, video cameras, and personal digital assistants. There were stacks of maps, in particular, maps of downtowns and nightclub districts in places like New York, San Francisco, Berlin, Paris, Madrid, and London, along with a host of more minor cities like Geneva, Bruges, Liverpool, Dublin, and Prague. "It's not that strange," Swan said. "Good. I'm glad to hear it," Luke said. "What is it?" Swan shrugged. "It's infiltration, like I've been saying all along. The one laptop I got a chance to look at was loaded with language software. French, Dutch, German, English. From beginner to level 5 conversational proficiency. Like Don and Big Daddy said, when the second team went down below, one of the rooms still intact in the bunker was set up as a classroom. They were training people to assimilate. They were going to, or already have, sent people to Europe and the United States, pretending to be exchange students, native speakers, world travelers, whatever you like." Luke believed that was true. "I think that part is obvious on its face. But what about the codes?" Much of the paperwork and the computer files were written in complex codes that, at least in the past several hours, no one had been able to break. The concern was, of course, that moles had been sent out into Western countries to prepare for an attack of some kind, or a series of attacks. As it was, the camp had been quarantined soon after Luke and Ed secured the place. They had been rushed out of there, and a forensic team brought in. Nearly all the materials on site had been confiscated and disappeared. Luke assumed that the CIA or NSA had the stuff now. If Big Daddy knew anything about it, he wasn't saying. For his part, Don had commended his team on a job well done and told them to come on home on the first plane. That was good enough for Luke. Nearly dying twice was plenty for one day. Swan stood up as if to go. He shrugged.
The codes explain the operation. They give the aliases and locations of the infiltrators and the instructions for where and when to launch the attack. Maybe. Or maybe they're the recipes for Killer Tabula. Who knows? I guess that's not our department now. And I'm happy to let the big brains upstairs try to puzzle it out. I'm going to curl up on a cot in a corner somewhere and get some sleep.
He paused just before leaving. He looked down at Trudy and grinned.
Care to join me?
She smiled.
On your cot? I'll find us a nice comfy one.
She shook her head.
Sadly, I don't think there will be enough room for you, me, and your legs.
Swan shrugged. His grin faltered only the tiniest amount.
Your loss,
he said, and went out. Now Luke and Trudy were alone. He stared at her for a bit. She looked like someone who had no business being here in Baghdad. She was very pretty, thin, with big eyes behind her owl-like glasses. She was young, just out of her teens, even though she had graduated from MIT a few years before. Luke knew Don thought highly of her. Don felt that she had the potential to be one of the best intelligence analysts in the business. Actually, Don felt that she had the potential to be one of the best whatever she decided she wanted to be. Luke suspected that Don was a little bit smitten with her, and more than in just a daughterly way. Luke could see it. If you looked at her long enough, you began to fall into her deep blue eyes. There was a mystery in there. "What about you?" he said.
What about me?
"What do you think about the camp? Strange place to train young metrosexuals to hang out in Paris nightclubs, no?" She paused for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. She had barely spoken during the meeting. She was the youngest person in the room, and the only woman. Don had prodded her a bit, but still hadn't gotten much from her. Big Daddy and Montgomery didn't seem interested in her opinion.
Well, yes and no, she said. Let's suppose that camp existed during Saddam's reign. It was well built, with an extensive tunnel system, air conditioning to protect the computer equipment, and lodging for the trainees. No one built all that on the fly since the war started.
True enough, Luke nodded.
Seems fair. Okay, then that suggests it was Saddam's government that organized the camp, and that they were training spies or maybe sleeper cells to carry out terrorist attacks or assassinations in Europe or the United States. It looks like they recruited young people, from the clothes, mostly young men. Maybe they chose them for their intelligence level, or their proficiency with language, or their athletic ability, or maybe even just their looks or their fashion sense. So they bring them to a camp well away from the rest of the society in the far-flung, inhospitable desert. Why?
Luke shrugged and smiled. You tell me.
Cross-training, for one. They can spend most of their time learning to look, speak, and act like Westerners or rich kids from upper-class Arab families. But they can also train with heavy weapons in the desert, far from any prying eyes. They can do survival and extreme climate training. The Western party kit is a cover story anyway. When push comes to shove, they're probably going to be called upon to kill people and be killed, or continue to function while uncomfortable or wounded and in terrible pain. What better place to be uncomfortable or in pain? Luke raised a finger. Good. I like it. You said cross-training for one. What else? She shrugged and smiled. Easy. That camp is pretty far from civilization. Far enough away for the trainees to maintain their focus. But it's a 4.5-hour drive from here. Close enough that the trainees can go home and see Mom and Dad during breaks.
Luke returned the smile. I can see what Don sees in you. A blush crept up Trudy's face. She shook her head. Then she looked up and stared right at Luke.
You want to see if there's any place still open to get a drink around here?
Are you old enough to drink? He said. Now her blush deepened.
You bet I am, Buster.
For a split second, Luke entertained the idea. A drink with a beautiful young woman in a far-flung and dangerous place. In another life, he wouldn't mind seeing where such a drink might lead. But it was after midnight here in Iraq, which meant it was mid-afternoon on the eastern shore of Maryland. I'd love to get a drink with you, he said. But I need to call my wife before I go to bed. She's going to give birth to our son pretty soon, and I want to remind her to wait until I get there. Trudy shrugged and smiled, just as Swan had done.
Your loss,
she said. Chapter 18, May 8th, 12:30 a.m. Central European Summer Time, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, May 7th. The Baroque Club, Rue de Rhône, Geneva, Switzerland. The night glittered. The car nosed slowly through the crowded streets of Rue de Rhône. The street-level stores, now closed, a paradise of the most famous and desirable brands on earth. Louis Vuitton was here, and Prada, and Omega watches, and Tiffany jewelers. There were chocolatiers and coffee shops, and all the beautiful people, walking and mingling and laughing, in sweaters and scarves wrapped around their necks. Of course, Elizabeth had visited this street before, but never at night. They were a block from where Lake Geneva emptied into the Rhone River, and she kept catching glimpses of it down alleyways and side streets. They know me here, Rita was saying. Just stick close, arm in arm. Act naturally and follow me in. The sea will part for us. And if you act like it's the most normal thing in the world, we won't have any problems. Elizabeth had already stripped down to her underwear and changed her clothes in front of the driver, who pretended he wasn't looking, but kept taking glances in the rearview mirror. After that little adventure, following Rita into a club should be a snap. They don't care about our age? Elizabeth said. She already knew the answer, because Rita must have explained it to her on a dozen occasions. But she wanted to hear it one last time. It might help to calm her nerves. Supposedly, the age required to enter these bars was 21. Rita shrugged. Age is for peasants. We are the elite. We do what we want, and we go where we want. The normal rules do not apply. Elizabeth nodded at the truth of this. The idea was disturbing and exciting and troubling and freeing all at once. Millions of people, billions of people, were leading their normal, average, everyday lives. But Rita was the granddaughter of publishing billionaires, and Elizabeth was the daughter of the President of the United States. Nothing about them was normal or average. They were like exotic birds, flying high above the crowds below. The car pulled up across the street from the club. Elizabeth stared out the window at it. There must have been 100 people waiting to get inside, all lined up along the wall, separated from the street by a red velvet rope. Rita? There's a lot of... Rita put a finger to her lips. Trust, she said. The partition between them and the driver slid down. The smell of his cigarette smoke entered their section. Rita handed the man a stack of cash. He didn't bother to count it. He must know it was more than generous. I will call you, she told the man. Maybe 4 a.m.? Maybe later. He shrugged and nodded. He's okay. Anytime. I'll be around. We'll leave this bag with you, Rita said, handing Elizabeth's knapsack through the opening. The man took it without expression.
"It's safe with me." "My ID's in there," Elizabeth said.
Her school identification card, her Texas driver's license, her passport. They were all in the bag.
"Better if you don't have it on you," Rita said. "There'll be less questions that way. Come on."
"Have fun, little girls," the driver said. They crossed the street arm in arm, just as Rita instructed.
"Laugh like we're already drunk," she shouted,
as though she was drunk and having a great time. Elizabeth did her best to match Rita's exuberance. They approached the velvet rope. A big man by the front door to the club saw them coming. He pulled the rope aside. Just before they crossed the threshold, Rita turned and pulled 3 young guys off the line. As Elizabeth looked on, she suddenly realized that one of the guys was Ahmet. He wore a black leather jacket and jeans. He had a blue scarf around his neck. He looked at her, then quickly looked away, as if he was shy. Then he looked at her again and smiled. Elizabeth laughed. Suddenly, they were through the door and inside the club. A group of 5 young people, 3 guys and 2 girls. The lighting inside the club was purple. Everything was gleaming. The bar, the dance floor, the metal railings. The floor was crowded, people barely dancing, but standing nearly cheek to cheek. Loud music pounded, the bass pumping below their feet, the lights pulsating. Elizabeth pressed through the crowd, following Rita toward the back. There was a room back there, with tables and sofas, a VIP section, purple lights swirling. That's where they were headed, to their own private table. It was an amazing night already. Everything about it was incredible, impossible, just the most... She didn't even have words for it. She was having the time of her life. Her mom and dad were going to kill her. She would be lucky if this little adventure didn't make the newspapers. Relax, relax, have fun. She tried to remember to breathe. A bottle of vodka came, along with a bottle of champagne. Rita always spent money like water. Ahmet poured drinks for everyone, including, most of all, for himself. Ahmet needed alcohol to calm his nerves. As soon as he had the glass of vodka and ice in his fist, he took a large gulp of it. The fire roared down his throat and into his belly. He took another gulp. Instantly, it sent its fingers into his brain, unlocking the machinery that had seized up. He became dizzy for a moment, and then he became himself. It was against his parents' religion, and against every tenet of how he was raised, of course. But those things didn't matter when you were sent abroad. Westerners drank alcohol. Westerners partied. So to fit in, that's what you did. And Ahmet liked alcohol. It made him feel relaxed. It made him feel more like Ahmet, if that was possible. It was as if he had been trying to be Ahmet his whole life, but never quite succeeding. And then, voila, just like that. Some alcohol would hit his bloodstream, and suddenly, here's Ahmet, the one we've been missing. Witty, confident, handsome, compelling. A very good conversationalist, and an excellent dancer. Ahmet came into his own when he drank. And just a little was enough to perform the trick. Waiting in the line outside, he had found himself gasping for air. He had almost become desperate for a drink. He should have taken one before he left the flat. This night, it was the culmination of a year of effort, a year of lies. It was the culmination of a year of training before that. It was the moment he had been born for. All of his potential was to be realized now, tonight. He could not let it slip through his fingers. The daughter of the President of the United States was sitting 3 feet away from him, and almost no one knew she was here. She was pretty, maybe even beautiful, in the big, well-fed, perfect-teeth blonde way of the United States. But her looks did not matter to him. He did not love her. He did not want to marry her or date her. He might try to kiss her, but only to put her at ease and lull her into a sense of security. But he had to act fast. She and Rita had slipped away from the security protecting her. How long could that last? Another hour? Another 5 minutes? When the security discovered her missing, they were going to come with the full weight of the imperialists. The entire country would be locked down. The city would be closed. The borders would be closed. There would be no way out. And then the house-to-house searches would begin. If necessary, the bloodbath would begin. Now. He had to move on this now. Everything depended on it. When he had poured her glass of champagne, he had slipped a little something extra into it. He had practiced just such a move his entire time here in Geneva, and it went effortlessly. It was just a tiny pill. It fell out of his sleeve, into his hand, and then into her champagne flute. It wouldn't make her sleep or pass out. It would simply multiply the effects of the drink, make her feel spaced out, and help her enjoy herself a little more. She might become a little confused. She might become more trusting than she otherwise would be. He tapped her shoulder very lightly. It was the first time he had touched her. She turned to him as if she had been waiting for this all along. He leaned close to her, but did not touch her. She took a sip from the flute of champagne. "Do you want to dance?" he said, not shouting, but loud enough for her to hear over the thump of the music and the chatter of the crowd. She nodded. "Yes." He held a hand out to her, and she took it. Her skin was white, and her hand was soft in his. He stood and led her away from the table. He waded into the crowd of strangers toward the dance floor, the president's daughter holding his hand. The champagne had gone to her head. It was just a few sips, half a glass. But she was not a drinker. It hit her like boom. She kind of liked the feeling it gave her. She still had the glass in her hand. She took another sip. They went out to the dance floor, where the crowd was thickest. People crowded in on all sides, some dancing with drinks and entire bottles of champagne in their hands. It could be New Year's Eve. The bass pumped, making the shimmering purple dance floor tremble. She and Ahmet began to dance, moving just a little, still more than a foot apart. Ha! The feeling was getting stronger. It surprised her. She was flying. She had never felt like this before. Ahmet moved gracefully for a man. He started to break it open, arms and legs moving. He could dance. He was a show-off. She laughed. Maybe he would twirl her. Suddenly, a black light began to strobe, and people would seem to stop in a freeze frame, then disappear. Dancing, dancing, stop, then disappear again. Women in the crowd screamed and raised their drinks in the air each time it happened. Elizabeth was about to do the same. But then she looked at Ahmet. Something about him had changed. The crowd moved around and behind him, stopped, then disappeared into the dark. Another scream went up, and a second later, the people materialized out of nowhere again. Ahmet was holding his head. His handsome face seemed anguished, in pain. He stopped, then disappeared. The screams were louder this time. The music was becoming more frenzied. When Ahmet reappeared, he was stumbling away toward the back of the club. His drink was gone. He was leaning over and holding his head. He went down a back hallway toward the bathrooms. He turned and spotted her. He waved her over. Elizabeth followed. Was he sick? Was he having some kind of health problem? He looked like he was about to throw up. She had just met him a few moments ago. They had hardly even talked. They had only just started dancing. Everything was going great. Now this. What was wrong? Ahead of him in the dark hallway was a lit-up exit sign. It was red, showing a male figure going through a doorway. Sortie d'urgence. Emergency exit. Was he having an emergency? Elizabeth put her drink down on a wooden railing and went after him. She moved down the narrow hall. She caught up to him. His face was stricken.
Ahmet, what's going on? I don't feel well. Should I call someone?
He shook his head.
I need fresh air, that's all. Please, join me outside, just for a few moments.
He pushed his way out the emergency exit and stumbled off to his right. No alarm sounded. Elizabeth looked back at the dance floor. The people bobbed and moved, packed into the small space. She still felt high as a kite. She wanted to dance. But a new feeling was washing over her. She suddenly felt confident and larger than life, like she was Ahmet's protector. He shouldn't be out in the alleyway, sick by himself. She would be the strong one. She followed him out into the night. Behind her, the exit door slammed shut. There was no knob or handle on the outside. The door simply closed flush with the wall of the building. Maybe she could pry it back open with her nails. Maybe she couldn't. There was no time to worry about that. Ahmet was still ahead, stumbling down the alley, holding himself up by using the walls around him. There were garbage cans and dumpsters back here. It was a long, windowless alley between buildings, and it smelled like rotting food. Circular fans blew steam out the back of the restaurants.
Ahmet?
Elizabeth shouted.
Are you all right?
He raised a hand at her. She came closer.
Ahmet?
He stood upright and turned to face her. He seemed to be crying. His eyes were red. His mouth hung slack.
I'm sorry, he said. I get migraines. Do you know what this is?
She nodded. She kind of knew what a migraine was. She kind of didn't.
Headaches?
She said. He nodded and took a deep breath.
Yes, severe. They can last for hours. I get dizzy. Sometimes I throw up. Pain pills do nothing. The black light. I wasn't expecting it.
He shook his head.
I'm very sorry. It's okay, she said. As long as you're all right. I can't go back in there. I will walk you around to the front again. We can send a message in to Rita. She will make sure you are readmitted.
Elizabeth nodded.
Okay.
It was a bizarre and disappointing end to her little date with Ahmet, she must admit. But maybe something good could still happen.
Maybe you will feel better in a little while, she said.
He nodded. He seemed weakened and drained of all energy.
Maybe. I don't know. It usually lasts for some time. Come, let's walk. Let's get out of this alleyway and back onto the street. It's better. Okay. But I think in a few minutes you're going to start feeling better.
If nothing else, the one thing Elizabeth had gotten from her dad and her entire family was optimism. She could picture Ahmet coming back around in no time. She felt a momentary pang when she considered her family. Had they realized he was gone yet? Man, there was going to be hell to pay.
I think we can get this night started again, she said anyway.
Ahmet half smiled.
I hope so.
He gestured to her.
This way.
She had taken several steps before it occurred to her that he was moving deeper into the alley and not back toward the street. The alley was dark back here. Several of the lights seemed to be out.
Is this the right way? She said.
She couldn't tell where the entrance to the club had been. They had gone through the entire club and into the VIP section. Then they had come back to the dance floor, and then down a hallway.
Yes, the street's up ahead.
Suddenly, a man stepped out of an alcove to her right. He was a tall man and dark. He looked very strong. He reached for her. Ahmet was several feet away and didn't seem to notice. He was still a little hunched over.
Ahmet?
Ahmet turned, his eyes wide. Now there was another man, this one behind her. She couldn't see him, but she felt his hands. He tried to put a cloth to her face. She ducked away and squirmed out of their grasp. A third man came from an opening on the left. He was dressed in black pants and a black long-sleeve shirt. All three of the men were dressed in black. She was tangled up with them, kicking at them. "Ahmet!" she screamed. She caught a glimpse of him staring at her, his face a grimace, of pain, of fear, of sickness, she couldn't tell. Why didn't he help her? Now she punched and kicked. She scratched at them. She tore at them. She had taken women's self-defense for an entire year. Her dad had insisted on it. She was good at it, one of the best in the class. She went for the men's weak spots, their eyes, their throats, their balls. She and her three attackers moved down the alley as one, arms and legs flailing like a giant octopus. "Help! Help! Help!" It occurred to her suddenly the thing you were supposed to scream when you truly needed help. Passers-by often ignored cries for help, but they never ignored this one word. She hoped someone was around to hear it. "Fire!" The man tried to put the foul-smelling rag to her face again. She ducked again, but she was running out of strength. Where was Ahmet? Now she couldn't see him at all. Maybe he was behind them. She put in one final burst, her last desperate gasp, and somehow broke away. Now she was running down the alley, three big men just behind her. Her shoes had come off in the struggle. That was good. She ran over the rough ground in stockinged feet. She could hear the men, their heavy breathing practically in her ear. She could hear their footfalls on the pavement. "Fire!" she screamed again. Up ahead, a dark car pulled across the mouth of the alley. "Oh, thank God!" She ran for it. The men ran after her, hands grasping at her. The car door opened. It was coming fast. Now the men were all around her again. They seized her arms. They moved with her momentum, letting it carry the whole group along. They were running her straight toward that open door. "Wait!" They all crashed as one into the car. She tumbled onto the seat, one man with her. He was the one with the rag. He lay on top of her, using his size to imprison her, suffocate her, weigh her down. Still she fought him. A man in the front seat was yelling something in a language she could not understand. She barely noticed. She scratched and clawed at the man on top of her. The man pressed the rag to her face. It smelled foul and sweet. She tried to turn away, but couldn't. Now the rag was across her face like a mask. She breathed it in. Darkness crept in from the corners of her vision. She was losing the ability to struggle. Her limbs felt heavy. The man on top of her cooed something to her in that strange language, gently now, as if he was a mother putting a baby to sleep. She could barely see him anymore. She tried to push him away, but he was fading. He pressed the rag to her face again. Everything went black. "Ah, holy hell." "Go, man. Can't you go any faster? It's the curves. Just take it easy." His name was Stephen Mostel, and his career was on the line. 16 years in the Secret Service, all of it going down the drain right before his eyes. 7 years on first family assignments, and nothing remotely like this had ever happened before. He punched the steering wheel. Damn it. He had gotten lulled to sleep on this job. Elizabeth Barrett was the girl who stayed home. She went from her dorm room to her classes, to the dining room, sometimes to the movie theater, and then back to the dorm. Sometimes she went shopping in Geneva on the weekends. He would never have dreamed, not in 1,000,000 years, that she would pull something like this. "It's all right," his partner Glenn said. "It's all right. We know who she's with. We know where they went. The driver said the Chadwick girl always goes to the same place, practically every weekend. The local cops and the other agents are converging there as we speak. This is going to be a big nothing. It's going to be okay." The Secret Service agents worked 8-hour shifts, 2 men per shift. When they weren't on duty, they all had apartments in Geneva. Every one of them, 8 other men, would be at the Baroque Club in minutes if they weren't already there. "It's not your neck on the line," Mostel said. "It is my neck," Glenn said. "I was on door duty. I should have been listening. I didn't hear anything. I was on grounds, man. They're going to crucify me for this. I'm supposed to see anything that happens outside her window. Somehow she got past me." "Can't you go any faster?" Glenn said. Mostel shook his head. It's the car. The car was a Volkswagen, built for the European market. It hugged the curves of the mountain roads just fine, and it was zippy, but it had no zoom. "Floor it!" Mostel floored the accelerator pedal, and the car picked up a little steam. They raced downhill and through a red light. A car coming from the right laid on the horn. They were passing into the outskirts of the city. He had to be careful. Even though it was late, this is where the traffic picked up. His jaw was tight. He was so angry. He was angry at himself for being slow-witted and checked out. He was angry at himself for kicking back and relying on the school's security system. He was angry at the other agents for treating this assignment like a low-key vacation. But mostly, he was angry at Elizabeth. How had she done this to him? He had been assigned to her for over 2 years. She seemed like a good kid. He was even somewhat friendly with her, as friendly as the job would allow. Now this. She had decided to have Elizabeth's big adventure at his expense. "I could just kill her," he said. It didn't matter what the man's name was. It didn't matter where he came from, or where he was going next. He was no one, from nowhere. He moved through the nightclub, crazy pink and purple lights pulsing all around him. The music pumped and thumped. Behind him, on the dance floor, people cheered and shouted. He was headed toward the VIP section. He was young. He dressed well. He was tall and blond. He looked like a big, healthy, rich Northern European, a man who liked to ski in the winters and spend the summers on the beach. He wasn't that, but it didn't matter what he was. He was here for only one reason. The girl, Elizabeth, had been taken. She was gone. The operation was a success. Now his job was to sever the last tie between Elizabeth and the rest of the world. That tie was straight ahead of him. She was a young woman named Rita Chadwick, a very rich and spoiled girl. She had made a terrible mistake and sent her friend to certain death. She didn't even know this yet. Look at her. She was sitting at a table in the VIP area, pouring champagne and laughing with a group of her admirers. She was pretty, with long black hair. But the way she opened her mouth when she laughed made the man think of a shark. As he walked, he removed from his pocket a 10-gram syringe preloaded with sodium pentobarbital in liquid form. It was a high dose and would kill her in moments, either from paralysis of the diaphragm or from cardiac arrhythmia. He pulled the paper wrapper from it. His intention was to simply walk up to the railing behind her, pop the syringe into her neck, and depress the plunger as far as it would go. He had administered injections many times in the past, and he didn't need to deliver the entire 10 grams to kill her. She was small. 10 grams would kill her several times over. After the injection, he would simply leave the building through the nearest emergency exit, not 20 meters past her. Her friends would see him, yes, they would. But they were all drunk, and his work would be done before they could move. Later, they would describe him to the police. Only by then, he would no longer appear as they described him. Here was Rita. He was moving close to her now. People were milling around very nearby. That was fine. Rita would never speak to anyone about her friendship with Elizabeth Barrett. She would never speak to anyone about her friend Ahmet and how they met. She would never speak to anyone about how Ahmet and she dreamed up a plan to help Elizabeth Barrett escape from her confinement. She would never speak to anyone again. He looked at the syringe in his hand. He had it right out in the open. Such was the environment at discos that a man could stand in a crowd brandishing a poison injection and testing the plunger just a bit. Rita and her shapely, beautiful neck were just in front of him now. She was all neck to him, like a goose or even a swan. A vein pulsed there. He reached for her. Bang! Suddenly to his left, the emergency door burst open. Large men surged in. The police. They pushed people to the ground, screaming and cursing. More and more of them came. 5, 10, 15. A few had their nightsticks out, wielding them, but not hitting anyone. Across the club, another group stormed in through the front entrance. Rita turned to see the commotion. Amazing! They were looking for her. 3 policemen climbed over the barrier and into the VIP area. Rita had moved away from the railing. The police were shouting at her. The man dropped his syringe to the floor. Mission aborted. He kicked it under a table. Suddenly, the police were on him, surging past him, shoving him to the wall and out of their way. The music stopped. The lights came on. The man allowed himself to be pushed and shoved along, his hands in the air to show they were empty. He was one of many, a face in the crowd, someone who is simply here for a night of good times. No threat to anyone. She did not know where she was. For a long time, Elizabeth drifted in darkness. But then her thoughts started climbing up and out of the abyss. They were confused thoughts, a mad jumble of images and ideas and sensations and disembodied voices, all superimposed on each other. She recovered slowly. She felt how her lungs were filling with air. And then she began to do it consciously and with pleasure. She was breathing. More clearly now she heard the car engine, and, mingled with that, the sound of unfamiliar voices. Several men were speaking in a language she did not understand. She tried to open her eyes. Her eyelids seemed glued firmly shut. They were so heavy it was almost unnatural to lift them. In the first moments, her vision was out of focus. It was like a photograph taken at night through a rainy, foggy window. Everything was smeared and hazy and very dark. But with each successive moment of consciousness, her wounded brain began to put all the puzzle pieces together. Soon enough, the picture became clearer, resolving itself slowly and inexorably into something she did not want to see. She found herself in a car full of strangers, driving through the night. Inky darkness flew along outside her window, shadowy landscapes that were formless and empty. The car moved too quickly over rutted and pitted roads, shuddering and banging the entire time. She could make out nothing about where she was. The car seemed to be passing through an unpopulated countryside. There were no lights out there at all. She was in the back seat of the car. The full horror of it began to sink in. What happened? Where are they taking me? Who are these men? As if on cue, that question was answered. Ahmet was in the front passenger seat. He turned and looked back at her. He stared at her for a moment, as if she were some kind of insect or an animal about to be dissected. Her whole body had gone numb. Now she noticed her tongue. It felt thick in her mouth. She made a sound like a shout, but also like the horrible groaning of an animal. The men ignored her. They talked incessantly, excitedly, almost in a panic. Their language seemed like the language of a lost jungle tribe. A sudden attack of fear surged within her. I can't do this. I do not want to go anywhere with these people. She wanted to go home. She wanted to go back. Her heart beat at a furious pace, and the blood pounded inside her temples. She pictured her mother and father, the terror they would feel. How stupid she had been. Someone said something she did not understand. Maybe they were speaking in Turkish, since Ahmet was a Turk. Is he really a Turk? She realized she knew nothing about him. Only what Rita had told her. He could be anyone from anywhere. Terror suddenly took hold of her. He could be anyone. She wanted to run away so badly, to run away and forget all of this. She wanted out. I need to go to the bathroom, she said. Nobody seemed to pay attention. What if they don't speak English? But it couldn't be. She knew for sure that Ahmet spoke English. I need to go to the bathroom, she said again. The man behind the wheel said something in the foreign language. Ahmet pulled a bottle from his leather jacket. It was filled with a dark liquid. Ahmet stretched out his arm to give Elizabeth the bottle.
Drink this.
His eyes sparkled at her. He looked like a demon. She shook her head.
No, I won't.
The big man who was sitting quietly to her right all this time suddenly turned toward her, and with only his left hand, he pressed her entire body against the seat. The man held down her body with his terrible strength, and at the same time, he opened her mouth with his other hand, compressing her cheeks together, his fingers painfully pushing into her skin. Ahmet stretched back from the front seat, held the bottle above her head, and poured the alcohol into her mouth. It burned like wildfire. The flaming liquid fell onto her tongue and flowed down her throat. The nasty liquid warmed her from the inside. A surge of heat suddenly enveloped her like a cozy blanket. The voices faded and started drifting somewhere far away. She felt much better. Strange waves of sensation were already carrying her into the darkness. Again. They were alien to her, men with blurred faces, framed by dark hair and beards. She did not understand what they were saying, and she did not care. She was beyond caring. She felt herself floating in the air like a balloon, so light and indifferent. She could no longer think or feel. She did not belong to herself. Her life was to be decided by strange and scary people. She could not resist anything. She could not say anything. She could not speak at all. One of the blurry faces spoke to her in English. His voice seemed to echo from far away. "We're going to be in the open for a moment," he said. "Don't cry out or say a word. No one will help you." Was she hallucinating? The men all seemed to have the same facial features. They were just blank faces, washed out, pixelated, devoid of any specific characteristics, as if they did not have faces at all. The dark framing of their hair and their thick beards made their heads seem disproportionately large. They were men with gigantic heads and faces that all looked identical. She was out of the car now. Suddenly, the darkness enveloped her again. But this new darkness was different. It was not the kind of darkness into which you fall instantly and disappear into a deep abyss, and which doesn't give you a chance to get scared for even a split second. It was not the same kind of darkness that she had already experienced. This time, it was a darkness where you realize that the worst is just moments or even seconds away. It was the kind of darkness the condemned man experiences when he is brought to the scaffold to be executed. They had covered her head with a black hood. One of the men carried her. She felt herself become like some boneless deep-sea creature, a jellyfish, but a jellyfish made of bread dough, malleable and light. Her breathing slowed down. Her heart was barely beating. Her muscles became limp and formless, and her body was slung over someone's shoulder like a bag of rice. She knew it was the beginning of the end. Soon she would be killed. There would be no explanation of anything, just darkness, confusion, and then death. She saw her father again, looking for her, very scared. Her father, the President of the United States. She would tell them. It was all a mistake. They had taken the daughter of the President. They were going to be in big trouble. Of course, they knew that already. That was the whole point of this. The weight of knowledge landed on her with a nearly audible thud. This wasn't a mistake. It was a kidnapping, and had been planned long before. Rita had done this to her. Where was she now? Was she in on it? It was cold out, and she felt them crossing a gap, an empty space, a threshold of some kind. Then she was sprawled on a padded seat, and her face was uncovered. They were moving once again. She looked out and saw that they were on a boat. The boat racing, bounding, no lights on, across vast and open water.